How do cancer patients hold on to hope without clinging to an unrealistic future? And how do we catalyze systemic change in our healthcare system so that people living with cancer have the option to access psychedelic medicines? In today's podcast, we're speaking with Dr. Tony Bach. Tony is a palliative care physician, oncologist, and psychedelics researcher at the University of Washington. He's also a long-term Zen practitioner who brings his Buddhist practice into patient care. Tony was one of the earliest doctors to publish about his personal psilocybin experience, and he recently studied psychedelic therapy for burned-out healthcare workers. Tony and I explore the paradox of hope in cancer. Hope can be a powerful motivator carrying us through brutal treatment, but can also become toxic magical thinking. And Tony offers two contradictory perspectives that somehow both feel true. Hope as an essential element of cancer care, and also hope as a distraction from the present. We also discuss his strategic approach to social change, from training doctors and having difficult conversations to reducing psychedelic stigma in the medical community. This podcast is brought to you by Healing Cancer Journeys. We're a nonprofit providing education and community for people exploring psychedelic medicines in their cancer journeys. You can find us online at www.healingcancerjourneys.org and follow us on Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, and Substack, where our handle is Healing Cancer Journeys. I also want to take a moment to recognize our friends at Survivorship Collective. They're doing truly pioneering work as the first nonprofit offering state-regulated psilocybin retreats specifically for people living with cancer and for their loved ones. They have a special couples and caregivers retreat coming up this April, and their work is grounded in a powerful vision, a world where people facing serious illness have access to all the tools they need to make the most of the time they have, whether that time turns out to be long or short. Survivorship Collective is a 501c3 public charity, and they're currently seeking scholarship sponsors to support participants experiencing financial hardship. If you're interested in supporting this mission and helping expand access to this kind of care, I encourage you to visit survivorshipcollective.com. Of course, the content in today's podcast is for educational purposes only, and it is not intended as medical or legal advice. I hope you enjoyed today's conversation with Dr. Tony Bach. Tony Bach, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, Dan, thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for being here. So, Tony, you are an oncologist. You're a palliative care physician, and you've done a lot of work with psilocybin. And I want to spend most of the conversation focusing in on your work with psilocybin, but I want to push back into some of the earlier work that you've done around communication between doctors and patients, especially communication around hard conversations.
Yeah.
And this is hard conversations that you've provided training on to help doctors navigate. And this is work that you've done in OncoTalk, in Vital Talk. And tell us a little bit about what initially sparked your interest in that doctor-patient communication realm.
Yeah. Well, I was a sophomore in college talking to an oncologist on a dorm phone. Remember the days of landlines when you used to talk at the end of the hall? Maybe you're not that old. Anyway, I was there talking about my mother who had had a blood cancer for several years by the time I got to college. And then she had a big complication, ruptured her spleen. And my father, who really just had no idea what to say, right? Oncologist on the phone. And the oncologist talked to me all about her spleen, like massive detail about the spleen. Didn't really talk about the big picture. But somehow from that conversation, I realized, you know what, I should leave finals week and just fly home. And so that's what I did. And that was the beginning of my introduction to this field. You know, fast forward many years later, I was in medical school and I watched these like really famous doctors talk to patients. And I thought, does anyone really know how to do this? And, you know, we had just rounded on a patient who had died unexpectedly. And the doctors, the attending physician, this really famous guy said, well, she was an old trout. And we all followed him around the corner like a school of fish. And I thought, doesn't someone say something about this? It's weird. And so that was the beginning of my introduction. And then as I got further into this as an oncologist, I realized that most of the time, what attending physicians did was basically avoid those
Yeah.
conversations and give
Yeah.
them to the most junior person on the team
Yeah.
at the time, me,
Yeah. Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And I would go in having just no idea what to say,
Yeah.
but realizing, from my own personal experience that this was going to be a moment for these people,
Yeah.
right? So that's kind of how it got started.
And as an oncologist, as a palliative care physician, you've had thousands of these conversations. As a patient, I too have been part of some of these hard conversations. And I think we know from personal experience that those conversations are hard, but you've had an opportunity to really research them, to train other physicians. And I'm curious, why are those conversations about death and poor prognosis and treatment trade-offs, why are they so hard? What are some of the biggest challenges that patients and doctors face in having that dialogue?
Yeah. Well, first of all, having that conversation about a poor prognosis or that the treatment is not working, that is not usually what a patient is hoping to talk about with their
Yeah.
cancer
Yeah.
doctor, right?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
it's disappointment to begin with, and everybody
Yeah.
knows that it's going to be disappointing. And I think as an oncologist, I felt bad, right? Treatment
Yeah.
I recommended didn't work. And like, what does that mean about my trustworthiness? What does that mean about, my ability as an oncologist? What does that mean about the value of these treatments that people
Yeah.
take that are hard? Like they're
Yeah.
not just neutral. It's not like a blood pressure pill you take every day. I mean, these are like life-changing treatments.
Yeah.
And so, I think there's a lot at stake for both the doctor and the patient. And so I think that they're emotionally loaded conversations, right?
Yeah.
And so that makes them hard because there's this other layer besides just the facts that is always happening, which is, what are the emotions in the background of all this? And very often people with cancer are bringing their whole life experience, and there are often things about their lives that shape how they receive and engage in that kind of conversation that I just didn't know about, right?
Yeah.
So I'm
Yeah.
kind of discovering all that in real time and, trying to figure out where I am in all this and wanting to make sure that this person feels taken care of,
Yeah.
make sure that they feel like I'm on their team. So there's just really a lot going on at once in any one of these conversations.
I think you're right that it's so emotionally fraught for the patient to hear things that they probably don't want to hear, and for the doctor to have that sense of responsibility. And you mentioned that word trust, and I can imagine what it's like being in your shoes to want to build that sense of trust with a patient, and also having to potentially share some hard news. And I'm curious, when you're providing that training to physicians on how to communicate and build trust and navigate some of those emotionally challenging conversations, what advice you give to them?
Yeah. Well, I mean, here's the thing on the other side of this, all these challenges is that, the conversations work when people are real. When the
Yeah.
patient feels like the doctor is being real,
Yeah.
that is a trust builder, right?
Yeah.
And also, patients want to hear that, anybody with cancer, they want to hear the doctor telling them the truth. They want the doctor to be kind about it. There's
Yeah.
that no one wants to have their nose rubbed with lots of statistics about it that are really bad and scary,
Yeah.
but they want to know what's really happening because honestly, as a patient, you can't make good decisions for yourself. You can't claim your agency unless you really know what you're up against. And
Yeah.
that takes a bit of a process. And so on the other side of that is if you do a good job with these conversations, that is incredibly trust building. And
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
is incredibly gratifying as a doctor to feel like, wow, this person trusts me. Like
Yeah.
I have responsibility for this person's health and I can carry that out. So
Yeah.
the advice that, a lot of the stuff we tell people about having these conversations is one of the principles is that to remember that the conversation is always happening on two levels. There's the factual level, right? And then there's the emotional level.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
you have to address both levels, right? If you
Yeah.
just talk about the facts and ignore the emotions, you'll blow right past some really important stuff, right?
Yeah.
You won't realize actually that you need to take a pause and let
Yeah.
someone process something. If you don't notice that they're getting teary, you might just keep talking, not realizing that they're not going to hear anything else you're saying. It's actually not the time to keep talking. And so that's one thing, this dual channel thing going on.
Yeah.
The second thing is that you need to have a little bit of a plan about how to structure the conversation when you're the doctor, right?
Yeah.
Like, what do they know already? What are they assuming? What's the new news, right? How they reacted in the past to complicated stuff. And so all that allows you to build a kind of a strategy, not the
Yeah.
exact words, not the exact sequence, but it's helpful to know if somebody gets really quiet and they need a lot of time for you, or if somebody, as opposed to somebody who gets nervous and then they talk a lot. And then it's actually helpful to engage with them. And then you can help bring their, nervousness down in a different way. So
Yeah.
those are a couple of the things.
And your point about being on that dual channel of these are the facts and also these are the emotions behind the facts, that is just so important. And thank you for providing that training, having been on the other side of those conversations and sometimes had the conversations without the emotional component. It's just
Yeah.
so powerful that oncologists can bring that emotional dimension to the conversation. And I'm curious how that begins to tie into some of the work that you've done with psilocybin. So, 19, you published an article in the Journal of Palliative Medicine. The article was called What Psilocybin Taught Me About Dying. And I'm curious what that narrative thread is, that connective tissue from some of your work around doctor-patient communication into psilocybin. How did that early work shape how you came to psilocybin?
Yeah. Well, one of the big things I took away from that early work, which was, not only working on how to teach clinicians, but also listening to hundreds of hours of audio tapes of doctors
Yeah.
and patients and
Yeah.
watching videotapes. And one of the big lessons for me was that if I behave differently, the person I'm talking to will behave differently, right?
Yeah.
Like if I take my time, I'm kind, they will be more thoughtful,
Yeah.
right? If
Yeah.
I respond to their emotions and their sadness, they will respond to me just as a person, right?
Yeah.
And so that principle of if I'm different, they will be different, that
Yeah.
really took me a long way. And then when I first learned about psilocybin, I was like, wow, this could be a way for me to really get a whole nother level on how I operate and all the assumptions and the habits that I bring to it. I wanted to learn more about that. So that was
Yeah.
the curiosity that got me into psilocybin. The other part of, I had heard all this stuff about ego dissolution and what that would mean. And that kind of intersected with another part of my life, which is that I'm a long-term meditation person. I'm a long-term
Yeah.
Zen practitioner. And that entered into it because I had been wrestling with my ego and all the conditioning I have as as a man, as an Asian, as a doctor, all that. I
Yeah.
had been wrestling with that for a long time. And so that was the other piece that got me into this deep curiosity about psilocybin and wanting to try it myself, because I knew as this research was coming out that patients would ask me. And you know what? I wanted to be able to give them a real answer. And it's one thing to say, well, I recommend this chemotherapy because it's the best for colon cancer. It's a different thing to say, there is something worth considering about this, right?
Yeah.
Might not be for everybody, but there is something real and I have experienced it too, right? Like
Yeah.
that's just a different level of recommendation, right?
Absolutely. And what's interesting to me is you had the experience, you used psilocybin, and also you published. You published and you did that very openly within the cancer community. And I'd
Yes.
love to hear a little bit about your thought process to not just experience psilocybin,
Yes.
but to publicly share that experience.
Yes. Well, so another thread in what has moved me forward is really about social change, right? And I'm a gay man who came of age in the East when, it was hard to be a gay man because everyone was getting AIDS and dying. And there was a big societal, conversation about it going on. And one of the huge lessons I learned from that which I learned from an activist in Washington, D.C. I went to the March on Washington, and they said, until everybody comes out, this is not going to change. And I was kind of skeptical at the time. But later, I realized they were totally right.
Yeah.
And that's what's led to the kind of social change we've had now. And so then when I got into the psilocybin business, or got into that area of the world, I realized the same thing was going to be true for the researchers and doctors. Right.
Yeah.
Until people who were in positions of power and authority and knowledge said, I have tried this and it's really valuable, I felt like that wasn't going to change. So my wanting to be public about that, even though it was an illegal activity, it's an illegal activity, that was very intentional. And,
Yeah.
I figured actually I was at a point in my career where, if they wanted to come after me, okay.
Yeah.
I was willing to deal with that. And it turns out I have, dealt with the Washington State Attorney General's office before. I've talked to them about different things, and they had talked to me a bunch when cannabis was getting legalized. And you know what? And what I knew is they weren't going to care about this. One doctor was to try this out. They don't have the bandwidth for that. That's not what they're interested in. So with those two things in mind, I went forward and I thought this is, and also, I had a kind of stature in the palliative care world. As an academic, I was pretty well known. And so it was a thing for me to say I had done this and learned something from it. And that was the that was the stance I was hoping our field could take towards this new emerging treatment.
And that model for social change and coming out, as it were, personally to drive that social change is so powerful. And I just want to put that decision into context. So this was 2019. This was a little bit earlier in the psychedelic renaissance.
I wrote it in 2018 and it got published, late in the year. And so it was, it was
early. You were a doctor talking about using a Schedule I substance, and that is an act of bravery. And I would love to hear a little bit about the courage and the conviction that led you to do that.
That I was thinking so much about courage.
It is an act of courage and bravery.
I knew I was taking a calculated risk, and I was pretty calculated about it. And you know what? My own sense of how social change happens, it happens because, like Margaret Mead says, a small group of dedicated people start to do the right thing and people listen. And I felt like having a doctor say, this is valuable in a way that could be therapeutic for people who are suffering, that would land in a different way than other discussions about legalizing, illegal substances. Right.
Yeah.
And so it was really about that. Yeah.
And so you've had personal experiences with psilocybin. You've been very public about those experiences. And also you've done quite a bit of research yourself on both doctors and patients. I want to talk a little bit about that research. In 2024, you published an article, and I'll read the title of the article aloud because I think it explains what the paper is. So it says psilocybin therapy for clinicians with symptoms of depression from frontline care during the COVID-19 pandemic. So self-explanatory. The results from the research showed a decrease in depression among those healthcare workers who had used psilocybin. I'm interested in two stats that came out of that and to get your perspective. So one of those stats is that you had 30 slots in the studies, 30 available patients. And for those 30 slots, you had 2,200 applicants, meaning that you had 70 people apply, 70 healthcare professionals apply for every one slot that you had available. And I'm curious what that tells you about healthcare professionals and psilocybin.
Yeah. Well, the first thing is that I think it says healthcare clinicians are in a really tough place.
Yeah.
Right. Both doctors and nurses. Today we're talking, it's the day that 12,000 nurses in New York City are going on strike, basically because of working conditions, because they're not being staffed adequately. They're not being treated respectfully. And this is part of a much larger pattern in healthcare that COVID just accelerated. The inequities and all the difficult things about being a clinician just got compressed and concentrated during the COVID pandemic. And so, there's been this thing known as burnout for a long time. Problem is, nobody really knew what to do about it, right? There's
Yeah.
not really evidence-based treatment for burnout, right? It's just and most of it is just sort of experience, meaning it's just a lot of job owning. And, it hasn't been studied very well. So you take a promising new therapy like psilocybin that had a buzz about it, right, because of Michael Pollan and stuff. And then you put it in this context of actually, we recognize that you are suffering, and everybody just went, oh my God. Right.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so I was hearing from people all over the place because healthcare workers in the pandemic, the first wave of the pandemic, there were just so many deaths, and healthcare workers were experiencing them at a rate and intensity that they just had never seen before. Most emergency room doctors haven't worked in a war, right? And it was like that intensity of death. People would come in gasping and they'd die in front of you an hour later, and everyone was kind of traumatized, right?
Yeah.
And then later when the, vaccines came out, and then these huge political things about the vaccines, that became a painful thing in a different way. But all those things to say that this problem isn't over, really. It still exists, but it just hit a nerve at the moment. And I think that's what that demand was.
And so it certainly hit a nerve in terms of highlighting the burnout and the trauma that healthcare workers have experienced through COVID. I'm also curious what, if anything, that 2,200 applicants for 30 slots tells you about perceptions of psilocybin within the healthcare community.
Well, so I will say in the background, the social change part of me is also going like, you know what? This is a group that could really help drive change, right?
Yeah.
This is right because the people in the study, they're not a bunch of psychonauts who are like, yeah, we'd like to be able to do this more easily.
Doctors and nurses, right?
Right. They're like, we have never tried psilocybin, and we would not do it unless we were kind of desperate, right?
Yeah.
And I think that just puts the whole discussion in a different light.
Yeah.
And so that was intentional to have doctors and nurses who were suffering because of their frontline work. We did a whole series of lotteries to get through, hone that group down, which was hard. But I was hoping that it would create something that would say, there really is a use for this, and there really is a use that is relevant now, right? I'm not sure that has quite come to bear yet. I was thinking I might hear from health systems or something after that study was published, and actually that has not happened. So, but it's out there, and I think it's a powerful statement about what's possible here.
And it's interesting to hear your theory of social change and how intentional and strategic you've been in your personal communications, and then how you've designed studies around healthcare professionals. And so social change tends to be slow, and then it all of a sudden happens very, very fast. And it's interesting to hear how intentional you've been. I'm also curious about another stat that came from that studies. This was a note, and it was a single paragraph, and the paragraph said along the lines of, it should be noted that 70% of participants reported substantial work changes or full-time equivalent status after follow-up. Now, they all remained in healthcare, but it sounds like 70% of them had some sort of change in their career, which tells me that not only is the depression coming down, but there's some sort of change in their lives, in their careers. And I'm really curious, what happened with their careers, and what do you make of that impact of psilocybin on their career decisions?
Yeah. Well, one of the big consequences of a well-held psilocybin experience is that you really reevaluate everything, right? And for these clinicians, a lot of it was about, what am I really doing here? What should I really be doing? And that led to a lot of them seeing that in their current jobs, the stuff they really loved, they just were not getting enough of. And these are people who they're talented people. It's not like they have to stay in this one job, right?
Yeah.
And so they were reevaluating and going, you know what? I think it's time for me to evolve my career a step. I remember an ICU doctor who said, I see all this overuse of technology, and I'm starting to realize that I might be part of this system that's a problem. And so it wasn't like he was doing anything bad, but he was recognizing that there might be a way for him to do the kind of medicine that he really cared about that was in a different setting, that he had never taken the time to think about before.
Yeah.
There was a nurse who just felt really battered by her. She felt like her colleagues in administration had just left the nurses out to dry, hung the nurses out to dry, right? This was, remember in the days when, only one person would go into an ICU room, a nurse would go in there and be alone with a dying patient for like 6 hours at a stretch, right? And then come out to go to the bathroom. And she felt like the workplace she was at was just not cutting it, and realized that workplace was not going to change. And so she said, you know what? It's time for me to find a different place. And so she did. And so I think of those as actually healthy changes. All of us get to these turning points in our career. All of a sudden we go, whoa, is this the right path for you right now? And so I think you could see psilocybin as not fixing their symptoms, but it was kind of waking them up to what's my work as a healer really about. And so I think that's what that was about in every case. There's an ER doctor who said to me at the beginning of the study, you know what, I feel more disposable than a used COVID swab, right? Ooh, right?
Yeah.
Like that, ouch. You just kind of go, that is not a situation where you can persist, right? And persisting it's not a matter of being heroic. It's a matter of recognizing what your gifts are really about.
And it's just interesting in the context of social change that with the experiences that these healthcare professionals had with psilocybin, it led to career changes. And if you extrapolate that change out to a larger scale, some of the potential social change that I think is possibly exciting of a healthcare system where people do have more purpose, but also perhaps a little bit scary, right? Where it might trigger some change that folks might be a little bit uncomfortable with. So it's really interesting.
Yeah, totally. You mean a change that, so, doctors and nurses, like we are not like usually the forefront of change.
Yeah.
That's not what clinicians do, right?
Yeah.
And yet, part of this is reflecting is right now that the system it's a hard place. And, you hear so many people say about how the system is broken. And actually, we are at a point in the history of medicine where I think incremental change isn't actually what we really need.
Yeah.
We need some big thinking and some bold action. And the whole thing can't be driven by shareholder value, honestly, in my opinion. The level of technological has reached a point where it's really driving the whole thing. And what happens is that technological complexity and attending to it comes at the expense of the relationships that make all that technology matter.
Yeah.
Like you can be the best surgeon in the world. If you can't talk to a patient well enough to convince them that they would benefit from your incredible surgical expertise, they're not going to agree, right?
Yeah.
If I'm a medical oncologist and I can't make a case to a patient why they should do this chemotherapy, which sounds scary and hard, because actually it is scary and hard, they're not going to do it, and they won't get the benefit of it. Right. And so we need both of these things. And
and this is getting back to what you said earlier about having that 2-channel communication, of having an emotional context, of building trust, because it's not just laying out the facts, cost benefit, safety, efficacy trade-offs. There's an emotional component there, and there's a trust component that is so important.
And remember that emotional thing, I mean, that is the way our bodies and beings have evolved to make very sophisticated calculations about what we should do next. Yeah. Our emotions are there to guide us, right? Yeah. They're not there just to take us on these joy rides. They are there to help us figure out what to do next. And the emotion system, actually, it acts faster than our cognition. So your emotions happen faster than your thinking. So that's why the emotion always happens first. And once it starts, you can't stop it. And you shouldn't try and stop it. It doesn't help you make decisions if you stop your emotions and try to freeze them and ignore them or put them away. That actually backfires just about every time. And so really our emotions are part of our wisdom that is trying to tell us something, right? And so we all have to listen to that.
Absolutely. I also want to ask about some of the research that you've done using psilocybin among people with cancer.
Yeah.
And you've recently done research on folks with metastatic cancer, studying the impact of psilocybin in a group therapy setting, and also administering psilocybin in more of a retreat environment rather than
Yes.
a clinical medical environment. And tell us a little bit about that study and what you learned, what you took away from that research.
Yeah. So I wanted to do a study where psilocybin was given in a way that was closer to the indigenous practices where people have been using these medicine for hundreds and thousands of years, right?
Yeah.
And so I had, I had gone back and forth to the Netherlands to do some work at a legal retreat center there where they did psilocybin in groups. And so, in my nonprofit Vital Talk, I had done a lot of work with people groups and have been part of a number of cancer support group organizations in different ways. And so I've seen the power of people with cancer talking to each other and supporting each other. And in some ways, there's nothing like it, right? Like if I'm in a group of cancer patients and one of the patients says something to the other patient, like that is 10 times more meaningful than what I would say as a doctor because it's experience talking to experience, right? It's not that they're dissing me. It's just more compelling, right? So I wanted to take that into the psilocybin realm because, I've seen these rooms where they do psilocybin, in the other studies and on the individual level, and they're nice clinic rooms, but I don't think they take advantage of what happened to psilocybin, right?
Yeah.
Psilocybin, like many psychedelics, it is a non-specific amplifier. So it amplifies your sense of everything around you. So if you're in a natural setting, it amplifies your connections with nature. If you're right, and the cycles of birth and death that are happening all the time through nature, that are always present. If you're in a group of like-minded people, that sense of connectedness, it amplifies that, right?
Yeah.
If you're with facilitators who represent a whole bunch of different things, it amplifies that. And so I wanted to take advantage of that characteristic of psilocybin to create an experience that was really more like a healing ritual. So people come to this retreat center. It's in a rustic place. They meet the facilitators. We all speak on a first name basis, and we conduct a thing where people are stepping into a sacred space for themselves. They bring things, parts of themselves. They talk about parts of themselves. They connect with all of us. And then they have psilocybin in a setting where they have been speaking their intentions. They're soaking up the nature. They're held in this kind of emotional container and spiritual container. The scientific question was, is that safe? Is the FDA going to let us do this, right? Can you do this in a way where you won't have complications? So in a way, I have all these high-minded ideas, but we're starting with a very basic study objective. So we did that. And what we found is, you know what? It's safe. We can do it. People had amazing experiences and it felt like totally. And I think actually that is the vibe I wanted because I think coming to terms with your mortality, it's not a matter of sitting in a clinic, right? Yeah. That is not what your life is about.
Yeah.
So that was inspiration for that study. And so I am really hoping to do more work with groups and retreat centers and more studies because I think there's something really powerful to it. And I think it just amps up the power of a psilocybin experience in a way that makes it really meaningful and durable. I'm thinking of one guy who said, he had a very vivid experience. And he said he went to the bathroom and he realized he could pee jellyfish because he could see these jellyfish in the toilet.
a non-specific
And they were-
amplifier.
Right. He said, they
Like
were so beautiful and moving in harmony. I didn't know I could do that. Right. And then later, he was like, then I was trying to make sense of everything. And I realized how absurd it was to try and make sense of everything. And so I unclenched my jaw and let go. And I realized that's what letting go is. And he said, I wanted to yell and scream and be angry at my cancer. And then I realized how absurd that was. So
Yeah.
I laughed and gave it a hug and forgave it.
Yeah.
And I'm like, wow, in 25 years of medical oncology, I had not heard that kind of an account before having somebody on a psilocybin experience. And so I think there is something really different than just having a great therapist who you see once a week for a long time. I mean, there's a place for that, don't get me wrong, but this is a different level of thing.
It's so interesting. You know, I somewhat similar, although in some ways dissimilar experience with my own cancer and my own psilocybin journey of kind of having a conversation with cancer. And I was looking for meaning and why did this happen to me? I tried to have a conversation with cancer and it didn't say anything back to me. And it helped me understand there is no cause, there is no meaning. And that was tremendously liberating for me. That
Yes.
being said, I did not see jellyfish in my pee. And so this individual came at it in a very different way, but it's a very similar outcome of just letting go and not having to, sometimes meaning making is powerful, but sometimes just letting go of meaning and letting jellyfish be jellyfish is even more powerful.
Exactly. And then just, feeling your body and right. Because I know that sometimes people with cancer, they end up being consumed by the search of why did this happen to me?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's, of course, an understandable and reasonable question. And there is also a point where sometimes it's time to step aside from that from time to time, not forever. So that's really a great story. Right. And also a beautiful realization about how to live forward. Right.
So you've had personal experiences with psilocybin. You've done research in psilocybin with doctors and patients. And also you're a practicing oncologist, you're a practicing palliative care physician. And I'm just curious what you have brought back into your own day-to-day care of patients based on all of these experiences that you've had, research that you've done with psilocybin.
Yeah. Well, you know what? I do want to be clear that I don't see cancer patients anymore. I do see palliative care patients, but it turns out I have really moved into the research space lately. And so that's really what I'm focusing on. But I will tell you, one of the big things I have brought back to my day-to-day work is this sense that everybody is just much more than they present to me. We all live on a couple of different layers, right? There's a biological layer that we talk about, but there's also a historical layer. We all bring these histories. We all bring these ancestral, parts of ourselves. And then we also are all kind of living on this mythic level too, a level that's bigger than human. And so one of the things it's all taught me is that I just need to pay attention to those. And I'm not the doctor for all these things, right? But I can welcome all that into the room, right? And when I am welcoming and people feel welcomed, they will talk about it, right? And having that kind of permission, I think creates a different kind of relationship between us. And a way for me to be more resourceful about who else I want to invite in, right? If I can get a sense that that's happening. And so I would say that's one of the really important things. And of course you think, well, I knew that. Well, and I did know that, but it's like you have a psilocybin experience and you experientially take something in and it comes out of you in a different way.
It's so interesting. You talk about having room for the mythic and the ancestral and the ceremonial, and some of those elements the ineffable, strange spiritual stuff sometimes stands in stark contrast to science. And Tony, you're a scientist, you're a doctor, you're a researcher, empirically grounded, data driven, and yet these things coexist, the mythic and the medical coexist together. And I'm curious how you've been able to integrate science and spirituality. Those are two things that are often at odds,
Yes.
at opposite ends of the
Yes.
pole. They exist in harmony within you. And so tell us a little bit about how you reconcile those two things
Yeah.
and integrate themselves into
first-
a whole being.
I wouldn't always say they're in harmony,
No,
but they do coexist. And
Yeah.
part of it is, I think they are different ways of knowing. They're
Yeah.
different aspects of human experience. And there is a truth to a kind of scientific experiment that is really valuable. For example, the experiment that we did with the group therapy for people with cancer.
Yeah.
I mean, all the safety outcomes, that is one of the things that science is really good at. Count the adverse events. That's really valuable, right?
Yeah.
On the other hand, this sense of being in touch with an ineffable, spiritual, kind of unnameable part of humans that is actually, of course, it's there, and we all know it's there. And pretending that it's not there, I think, is like ignoring part of us,
Yeah.
right? And so I feel like I have a different relationship with those parts of people that bring in, and when I invite them in, because I am as kind of the authority in the room, right? Like I'm the one who kind of sets the rules, right?
Yeah.
And if I say it's okay to talk about that, people like the guy's account I read have these amazing things that they bring in that are actually instructive for us all, right?
Yeah.
They are teaching us all how to live, right? They're
Yeah.
teaching me how to. And so part of what happens in that situation is that, they are learning some things from me. I am learning some things from them. And that creates a different kind of exchange than if I am the one who has to authorize and prescribe the chemotherapy because that's the evidence-based thing to do. There's a place for that. I am not dissing. There's a place for that, but it's only one part of them, and it's only one. Of course, when I'm with people with cancer, there's actually more going on than that, right?
Yeah.
We just don't talk about it or comment on it, right?
Yeah.
But there is some of the healing happens in those other spaces. And so that's how I think of them as different ways of knowing and being. And sometimes they don't sit together well. Sometimes it's, sometimes it's a little complicated.
But I hear you
very often you can make space for it all.
Absolutely.
Right?
And that's it. What I hear you saying is that there are different ways of knowing, and you're giving weight to both of them. You're giving value to both of them. And I think what often happens is folks tend to overweight the scientific and underweight the spiritual, or overweight the spiritual and underweight the scientific. And to have both of those coexist with some degree of importance and equal validity is just really powerful, because it creates that space, as you talked about, for a deeper exchange between a doctor and a patient, where it is their physical selves and their emotional selves and their spiritual selves in exchange with the doctor. And that
Totally.
whole self is just so powerful.
Yeah. Because, every once in a while, a patient will ask me a question that's really a spiritual issue, right?
Yeah.
And they want me to answer that. And so I try to do it, because if I just say, I can't answer that, that's not science. What happens is I am doing a kind of withholding of the person that I am from the person that they are.
Yeah.
They're not expecting science in that moment, right?
Yeah.
They're just asking as a person to another person, right? And so I have to be able to step up to those moments and recognize them, which I do not do 100%, but I'm better than I was before, and go, here's what I can tell you, right? And so there's something powerful about that, and there's something really beautiful. That is, there have been healers since the beginning of time. And even in this age of AI, you're still going to want to talk to a person, right? When it comes to something big. Am I going to start am I going to go to surgery based on Chat GPT? I don't know. I think I would still need to meet the surgeon, right?
So I have had lots of surgery, and I want to see that surgeon and have an exchange with that surgeon, because it is, again, it's going back to trust, and it's just so important.
So that's the part that we just have to That's the part that I think you and I both share this. That's the part that isn't always getting enough attention and resources right now.
I'm also curious. You had mentioned earlier in the conversation that you're a Zen practitioner, a practitioner of Zen Buddhism. I wanted to ask you a question about hope and how you think about hope as both a clinician and a Zen practitioner. You wrote a book, and the word hope is in the title of that book. So your book,
Yeah.
Mastering Communication with Seriously Ill Patients, Balancing Honesty with Empathy and Hope. And hope is one of those ideas we talk a lot about in the cancer community because sometimes it is all we have on the darkest days. And also, hope is a form of desiring, of striving, of grasping for some sort of outcome in the future that can be distracting to present realities. And I'd love to hear a little bit about what healthy hope looks like for you as both a doctor and a Zen practitioner.
Yeah. It's such a great question. So as a doctor, what I think about hope is, I think hope is an essential part of how people meet these difficult moments, right?
Yeah.
If you can't start to see or imagine your way into the next step, it is just so hard to do all the stuff that you have to do. I don't think it makes any sense for us to say, I'm just going to read you the data and that's all I'm going to do. Right. Like,
Yeah.
I think my job as the doctor there is to say, like, we are your team. We are pulling for you. Right. We are going to be here for you. That's what that hope is about. Now, I think the thing that can sometimes happen is the hope gets turned into kind of this magical way out there Oz thing that says, well, we have to have hope and we're just going to say we have hope, and how we cultivate it isn't so important. And actually, that's what I disagree with. So, right, like there are patients who are in really tough places where there are treatments that are not proven to work, and they are offered those treatments because the doctors think we have to give them hope. I'd say, I don't think that's ethical. Right. Like, I think that's misleading, honestly. And I think damage is done to that. It reminds me of a study I did where, we asked a bunch of cancer patients how they talked about prognosis with their oncologists. And these were all people with advanced cancer. And actually what they ended up all talking about, and these were people in hospice, and near end of life people. And what they all talked about was how they remembered the last conversation with their oncologist where they referred them to hospice, and then they never heard from them again. And I'm like, that is abandonment. So from the clinical point of view, I think the hope discussion is about, how can I help this person imagine some kind of future, regardless of the situation they're in? And can I give that future some boundaries so that it's tangible and realistic and not just fanciful? That's the trick. And so that's my clinical version of hope. Hope, like there was a guy in Australia who did a study about how we often talk about hope as something we give people, like it's a quantity, like there's a box of something I can hand you and that's hope and that's my job, right? That's a really hard job. Yeah. Whereas if hope is the process that we are engaged in together, if hope is the way I work, if hope is generated in the way I work with you and the way my team responds to you and the way my team pays attention to you, that's a whole different kind of thing. And so that's not always what people want. There are a lot of people who will there are some people who will fly all over the world because they want that, way out their hope. And if they do that, and if they need to do that, that is their thing. But that does not mean that is what I am in terms of what I think is a best practice and something that I can actually genuinely believe. That's my clinical version of this. Does that make sense? So hope is an orientation, right? Like this is Vaclav Havel.
It completely makes sense. And I'd love to hear the Zen perspective.
So here's the other side of this.
Yeah.
So the other side of it, the Zen side, is that hope is completely overrated. And we should actually stop wasting our energy. What we should do is we should pay attention to this present moment and the exact situation we're in. And we should take that in for all the richness and the beauty and difficulty that it contains, make decisions and create actions based on exactly what's happening right now, right? So the Zen perspective is that hope is not what we should be cultivating. What we should be cultivating is our ability to be in the present moment without distracting ourselves, without distorting things, without engaging in fantasies. That, in fact, we need to take a realistic, and that chasing all the things that our minds produce, our monkey minds produce, as ways to get out of a difficult situation, actually, in the end, it doesn't really help you. So it's a radically different view, right? Like that's a radical view of hope. But I think the thing that is really powerful about it is that one of the things we do is you can do as a clinician, you can do as a family member or friend, is you can help people see all of what's happening in their situation right now, right? It doesn't their whole life doesn't have to be pinned on a phase 1 trial or another surgery or something like that. I mean, those can be big things, but there's also a lot happening right now with you.
Absolutely.
And so, making sure that you have engaged and paid attention to all of that and that you're in it, that is part of living well, even in the face of cancer.
And I think that perspective on hope as both a doctor and a Zen practitioner, both of those are instructive for people living with cancer and who simultaneously need some sort of motivation to move into the future. And also, we have to live in the present because it's all we have. And both of those realities are true, and they're both instructive for folks living with cancer.
That's right. And so it's like, well, you were asking me, how do I make them all knit together? And they don't, they're not logically consistent or anything, right? One does not directly lead to the other. But the reality is that it's just, as you said, they're both really important.
Right. Well, great. Tony, last question for you. As you think about future guests that we might consider having on the Healing Cancer Journeys podcast, what are 2 guests that you would recommend, and what could they add to the conversation?
Well, so I have a couple of thoughts here. So one of the partners I work with in my research is a psychologist named Bonnie McGregor. She has a deep experience with working with people with cancer over time and a deep experience with groups. And I think brings a really beautiful perspective as a psychologist to what this work is all about.
Yeah.
And then there's another person who's a chaplain in this space, Juliana Perez. And she also brings this kind of broad-based spirituality into this. So I think those are 2 people who I think you'd have fun talking to.
All right. I'd love to
And
talk
I can
with them.
connect you with them if that would be helpful.
That would be fantastic. We would welcome that.
Sure.
So, well, Tony, that's all the questions we have for you. Thank you for the work that you're doing, obviously as a doctor, but as a soulful human that is caring for patients on multiple levels, not just physically, but emotionally and spiritually. So thank you for the work that you've done, and thank you for joining the podcast.
Thank you for having me, Dan. It's a great conversation.
Yeah.
And I love the work that you are doing.
Thank you.